following video interview is controversial in nature and does not necessarily reflect the views of the producers nor mainstream academia. The viewer is encouraged to refamiliarize themselves with the standard historical and scientific text before making presumptive conclusions.
If I say the word flying saucer or UFO, do you automatically think of somebody who's maybe nuts? You've seen one of these babies flying at high speed with no sonic boom, you know that that whole technology is out the window. Flying saucers are real, man-made machines.
Welcome to the 33rd Parallel, a video series about science, technology, and the politics that control it. What would you say to a person who told you that the history and physics we all studied in school were filled with lies and deliberate omissions? And what if a large part of these lies had to do with man-made flying saucers? Some have experienced bemused condescension at such a suggestion, even anger. After all, even if it were true, how would you prove such allegations? Where would you look? Well, our guest today has done a fair bit of looking on his own, an entire lifetime's worth, and has unearthed some startling evidence. Wilhelm Lyne is the author of 3 books, Pentagon Aliens, formerly Space Aliens from the Pentagon, now in its 3rd printing, Occult Ether Physics, and The Free Energy Surprise. Mr. Lyne was born in Big Spring, Texas, and raised in the boom towns of the great West Texas wildcatters. He had the opportunity of being educated about fuel and its impact on industry firsthand. From there, he pursued an interest in aviation in Army Air Force, where he earned a position in Air Force Intelligence. He has acquired a BS degree with a double major in Art and Industrial Technology from Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas in 1969. He also has the distinction of living in New Mexico for the past 25 years, during a time and place where knowledge of saucer technology necessarily meant knowing individuals who worked on top-secret projects at Los Alamos and Alamogordo, where individuals such as Werner von Braun and his Nazi collaborators were well known to the community at large, where, much like those individuals who had the misfortune of living in or near Mena, Arkansas, never got the chance to tell the rest of the world what was really going on. Well, today Mr. Lyne will do just that. Mr. Lyne, welcome to the 33rd Parallel.
Very glad to be here. Thank you.
To begin with, I'd like to find out what the reaction has been to your 2 books. Has it been favorable? Have you gotten a lot of feedback?
I get quite a lot of feedback from the more skillful researchers, people who are really digging for information. I don't get a lot of feedback from people who are convinced that aliens are abducting people and that our planet's being controlled by them.
Or like hate mail,
yeah.
People who
and I get a dead silence from the organized ufology community, which, in my opinion, is nothing more than a creation of the CIA. What I've found is that the official ufologists, who are actually agents of the CIA, they will not cite any source or reference which they do not control. So they will cite each other constantly. It's very incestuous, but they won't cite an outside person that they don't control, like me. So,
right. So their best way of doing approaching that is just ignoring it and hoping it'll go away.
Yeah.
There's another interesting aspect of it as far as disinformation. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of how disinformation works, but there's a lot of methods that are used as far as publication, for instance, in magazines like Aviation Week and Space Technology, which are used, it seems, to diffuse the type of material that you're coming on and talking about. For instance, there was an article in the May 1995 Aviation Week and Space Technologies. It was under the title of air spike technology, using what they called directed energy to suppress sonic booms, to move faster through the air, and they speculated in the article about saucer-shaped aircraft. Do you feel that they would, go to the trouble of putting articles like that in the papers to diffuse?
That sort of stuff is what I call it's a standard. All this stuff is, once you've studied it long enough, you realize it's a certain technique. I call it half-truth and the truth of a half. It's like it's either an overstatement or understatement, but in this particular case, they show a technology that, if it were true, it would be highly classified. Why are they putting it in this magazine for everyone to read?
That's true.
And if you examine the article and look and see what they're saying actually in the article, it is very carefully designed to keep everybody's mind thinking about typical standard aerodynamics and the dynamics of sound and pressure, which apparently flying saucers do not obey. I mean, if you've seen one of these babies flying at high speed with no sonic boom, you know that whole technology is out the window.
So you mentioned briefly about CIA tampering as far as media and things of that nature, and how they like to plant articles. A lot of people find this kind of stretching the truth, that they feel that our media can't be corrupted by such things, since we've had these exposés of the CIA and we know how evil they are and stuff like that, that we've somehow routed this out, and that somehow our media is free to pick any subject that it likes, and it just it's just the fact that they look down their nose at this idea that it could be controlled. What's your response to something like that?
Well, it's ridiculous, because the intelligence community not only tampers with the news media, they have people who are regularly employed to disseminate material through the public media, and they have contacts which they've developed over the years who do it on a regular basis for them, insert material in articles and so forth. They have even job classifications for this very purpose inside the intelligence community.
In fact, they have a neat little name for it, don't they?
Yeah, public information officer is one type of classification.
But the type of counterintelligence disinformation,
yes,
they like to use the term COINTELPRO.
It's like the time that I saw something in a magazine that I knew was classified, and I asked one of my co-workers, I said, how's it they can run this? This is classified. This is top secret. How can they run this in this magazine? He said, there's classified material published all the time in the magazines and papers, but we're not allowed to confirm it. So there's material available that's classified in newspapers and magazines, but it's never confirmed by the government, because that's a violation of the security regulations. And in many cases, someone who suspects something to be true, who's outside the intelligence community, will get something and put it in a publication just to try to evoke some sort of response from the government, to try to get it confirmed.
Oh. But maybe they don't have to go that far. There's, on the screen now, we have a Senate committee hearing on, this one's called the Supplementary Detailed Staff Report on Intelligence Activities and the Rights of Americans. This goes into detail about COINTELPRO and how the intelligence community basically influences what they like to call the friendly media. there's plenty of references. In fact, I'll show you the content page here, which talks about COINTELPRO, counterintelligence programs, who they use it on. And down here at the bottom of the screen, I'll just have to read it for you because COINTELPRO techniques in section A called propaganda, they have something called friendly media. What do they mean by friendly media?
Well, that means people who have been on the take. I mean, it's a standard procedure in the publishing business that if you want something, an article to be run, you just go and hand it to them and put your bribe money right under it.
Sure.
You see, I mean, my sister worked as a newspaper reporter for years, and there were women, for example, in the community whose husbands were lawyers and gave them a regular budget to make sure that their names appeared in the paper so many times and so often.
So motivated, bottom line, basically about money.
Yeah.
It's very simple to motivate people like that. In fact, in this Senate hearing, we have something called friendly media. Much of the Bureau's propaganda efforts involving giving information or articles to friendly media sources who could be relied upon not to reveal the Bureau's interests. That's interesting. So that establishes the fact that there really is media that is willing to go along with this. And we're not talking about some two-bit newspaper out in here in New Mexico or somewhere. We're talking about maybe mainstream media.
There was a recent incident that occurred in relation to the so-called Chinese intelligence flap that's going on through Los Alamos and the other national labs at the present time, and a list turned up in some files that listed various people as pro or anti-lab. And this raised some interesting questions, you know.
Pro and anti-lab.
Oh, yeah, for media releases, you see.
Sure.
They had a whole list of people that were either known as pro or anti, you know, as far as where they could be relied on, you know.
Right.
And so this raised some interesting questions, and they just buried that real fast.
Yeah, that would be a whole other can of worms that might actually educate people about how their government works. And in fact, if people want to know how our government works and who was on this select committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, we have somebody named Walter Mondale, another individual whose name is Gary Hart. And if we think that counterintelligence is just something that's on the left, we have Barry Goldwater, if you like the right. So basically it's controlled on both sides. You didn't hear a peep out of any of these characters about these Senate hearings or COINTELPRO. The fact of the matter is that the CIA is heavily involved in this country, as well as the FBI, in disrupting the rights of Americans, wiretapping, influencing the media, planting stories, and anything of this nature. Anybody who's interested in this volume of information can contact Joyce Riley, who talks quite a bit about Gulf War illness and is quite an advocate of exposing government corruption. So now that we've established that the government enjoys manipulating our media, let's talk a little bit about how it might try and cover some technology that they don't want to get into the public arena. Possibly this is a reason why flying saucers aren't talked about in terms of man-made technology. And you feel that there's a resounding silence in the community as far as reviewing your book or reviewing your book fairly in respect to this. Could you give us more details about that kind of reaction again?
Well, first of all, I want to say one thing about those who might be skeptical as to whether or not the government has manipulated them or not. I'll give you an example. You can ask yourself this question of whether or not your mind, your own mind, could be a barometer of government mind control, or rather thought control. If I say the word flying saucer or UFO, do you automatically think of somebody who's maybe nuts or an attention seeker or somebody who's, got psychiatric problems or, New Age, whatever. Just the mention of those words, the fact that it triggers that response in your mind, you automatically think that anyone who says that is off the wall and flaky, shows how much your mind has been influenced. Because flying saucers are real, man-made machines, and there's no proof that they're not man-made, but there's plenty of proof that they exist, and it goes back quite a few years. And this kind of technology that you have the article there on, now that's the kind of article that you find in a magazine about something where they want to make you think, well, we're working on the problem of this advanced flight system like these. That sort of implies that they're recognizing that UFOs exist.
So they're doing a kind of a backpedaling somewhat to try and shore up things in the scientific community that,
we're working on the problem,
right.
and maybe we'll get there someday.
Yeah, if you don't like the flaky stuff that we've been publishing, maybe you'll like something that we put in Aviation Week of Space Technology. The article is called Air Spike Could Ease Hypersonic Flight Problems. And in this article, it's very interesting because if you do take a look at Mr. Lyne's book and then you read this article, it's funny how it's almost like everybody's saying the same thing. This article was published May 15th, 1995, which was released concurrently with the second edition of Mr. Lyne's book. I'm sure that was just a coincidence. The first thing that they talk about is the flight characteristics. Estimates indicate that an air spike-equipped vehicle traveling at Mach 25 orbital velocity with respect to the exterior of the oblique shock wave would actually be subjected to Mach 3 conditions within the pocket formed behind the wave. How is that possible if gravity is not affected?
Well, that would be, 17,500 miles an hour, of course. And they're basically, you see, this kind of article, they're not going to use this technology. They just put this article out to make you think they're working on the problem. They're trying to make you think that there's some standard way to make using ordinary shock wave mechanics and electrodynamics and gas dynamics and other scientific disciplines, that they can make a ship go as fast as flying saucers have been reported to go.
Well, it's interesting that they don't even explain why you feel Mach 3 conditions behind the shock wave when you're traveling Mach 25. I mean, that's pretty amazing in itself. The article should be on just that.
Well, what they're saying is that this air spike gadget, which is out in front of this little ship, which is shaped kind of like a little pill, the little spike sticks out, and then there's a little sting on the end. When the sting's not in operation, they say you've got a conical shock wave, and when the sting is in operation, operating at something like 35 megawatts power, and it's a plasma arc torch on the end of the sting, that it creates a parabolic wave which reduces the pressure behind it and reduces the heat transfer problems that are associated with that kind of high velocity. But it's just a theory. It's been, they tested it in a wind tunnel, but they're not going to use it.
The second page of this, which shows the diagram, discusses for speeds above Mach 1, the vehicle would rely on a magneto-hydrodynamic fan engine. The lens-shaped craft would have an interior rectifying antenna to absorb pulsed focused microwave power on the outside of the vehicle to ionize air forced to the rim of the craft by the air spike. The rectennas, which they like to call it, also would pulse electric power through the ionized air, and in conjunction with two superconducting magnets ringing the craft, accelerate the air aft past the vehicle. According to Mirabo, which is the scientist involved in this wonderful device, this drive system also tends to eliminate sonic booms. Gee, just like what, I wonder? By eliminating pressure discontinuities, so the vehicle is silent but very bright in hypersonic operation. So we have a lens-shaped, glowing object that is silent in flight that he's speculating that someday we might have.
Yes, and what's interesting is the technology's wrong for that kind of propulsion, and they're making it look like that this is just on the horizon. Only 40-something years after the one I saw that didn't make a sonic boom, did not have an airspike gadget on it, and went between 9,000, possibly 25,000 miles per hour in 3 seconds. Now, it did 290-degree turns at above 200 miles per hour, absolutely square turns, and went to the point of infinity, which was the point at which I could no longer see the craft. So the speed of that craft would be determined by how far away I could see it. And I had noticed that I could see my geodesic dome in Hyde Park, which was about 30 miles from my home at the time. I could see my geodesic dome, which was 32 feet in diameter, so I have since revised my statements about the saucer that I believe it was doing more like 25,000 miles per hour.
So it was orbital velocity already?
Yes.
In 1952?
Yes, 1953.
1953.
In late summer of 1953, and there were 6 other people that I know of who were witnessing it, who were with me at the time. And,
that's interesting. It's interesting that the same scientist, this character named Mirabeau, we now have up on the screen in Popular Science an article by the same scientist, Mirabeau, who was talking about spinning this wonderful little saucer-shaped object you see here with lasers, kind of like that guy on the Ed Sullivan Show used to spin plates on a stick. This guy does it on lasers now. Apparently this guy's job is to keep creating saucer-shaped gadgets to keep us amused and thinking that things are still being worked on.
Yeah, that uses known technology rather than concealed technology.
So we have a totally different timeline than our friend Mirabeau here.
Yes.
And just to finish up on some wonderful disinformation, we have another saucer developed by Lockheed. This one, of course, has right smack in the middle of it, a fan jet engine so that this thing can fly somehow. And basically just tear itself apart in mid-flight. But, you know...
That device would burn the ship up from the friction of the gases entering the vents if it was enough to propel the ship. The only magazine even anywhere near them, Nexus magazine, which is more...
Which is out of the country. It's
yeah,
Australian.
Yeah.
So it's not...
And they've done a short review about, you know, a couple of column inches on the book.
Was it favorable?
It was... Usually they get everything wrong. They misquote me, and there have been a few writers who have written books. And they will say things that I didn't, you know, say that I said things that I didn't say, get me confused with other people,
so
and totally distort what I said.
But do you feel that that is deliberate?
Sure, certainly it is.
So do you feel that Nexus then is not a good example of something that's independent either?
I don't think so. I think the fact that they, when they did they had a change of ownership after they did the review, and they had more interesting, from my standpoint, they had more interesting material in there. Now they have more off-the-wall type of articles and so forth, what I consider off-the-wall.
I've noticed that they've been running these long string of bloodline of Jesus and things of that nature, and Windwalker series that deals with...
Chupacabra.
In fact, this brings to mind an article that they stuck in about some eyewitness to the fireballs, or the ones that followed the B-17s in World War II, the Foo Fighters.
Yes.
And this guy went out of his way to say that they were definitely extraterrestrial. And I couldn't help but think about your book and your take on the whole subject, and it just seemed to me incongruous even for Nexus to put something as uninteresting as that in their magazine.
Well, there are things about the fireballs, what they call the fireballs, Feuerball, which Kugelblitz is the German word they use to fire lightning, basically it would mean, which indicate they were manned aircraft. And yet you get a whole misinformational network that insists that there's some sort of little bitty balls like this. Well, the thing about a ball that's peculiar is when you see a ball shape, you can't tell how far away it is from you or how large it is.
Sure.
If you're inside that ball, it looks much larger than it is. If you're on the outside of the ball, it tends to look smaller. That's something I discovered when I built the geodesic dome. And from the outside, it looked a lot smaller, but when you were inside, it was huge.
So spheres have a problem with reference to scale.
Yeah, they tend to shrink.
In the open environment.
But it would only take, with the kind of technology that's used in flying saucer propulsion, it would only take a 4-foot ball to get a small person and the power system and everything inside. And the thing about the fireballs that makes them, that tells you that they're man-made and that they're not robot ships that are energy projected from the ground, is the fact that they followed the bombers and did all kinds of little maneuvers that would be far away from any ground base that could be doing the controlling. So they basically had to have a man on board to do that, probably a boy, probably in the Hitler Jugend, trained just for this purpose. And all their main purpose was to disrupt the communications and it was like a red herring, the distraction, because they were bombing the heck out of Germany at the time they got these things into
and the fact
sky.
that the electromagnetic radiation that they would create would disrupt circuits, wouldn't they, if
Yes.
they got close by?
Yeah, they don't need any special technology. I've got article upon article written about how this technology worked to disrupt the communications, and I've got news for them. It takes no special technology. The flying saucer's propulsion system will disrupt communications
Absolutely.
if it comes close to them.
Even in the extraterrestrial literature that they like to give us, cars still burn out, cars stall out and start up later when the thing passes by, things of that nature.
My father was helped for between 15 minutes and a half hour by one of these ships outside Levelland, Texas, in 1957, and he said nothing about it to me, and it wasn't until I turned on the morning news that I realized that his car lights were all burned out. He had to have them replaced, and that's when I realized that he'd had this experience with the ship. And so I went down to the Ford Motor plant in Odessa, Texas, Ford Motor house where they sold the cars and fixed them, and walked up to him and I said, "Why didn't you say you saw a flying saucer?" And he said, "Well, how did you know about it?" And I said, "I just turned on the morning news, and there were a lot of people that had experiences last night." And the mechanic said, "You know, this is the first time I've ever seen all the lights on a car burned out and not one blown fuse."
He hasn't seen too many UFO-related car problems.
The Germans were building dozens of weapons from Tesla's papers. And
including something that might be called a Foo Fighter.
Yes. And the Schildkröte, the Fliegende Schildkröte was a flying turtle, which is just another name for a type of Foo Fighter, except that what I've found is that there are several different types of ships. One is a linear, what I call a linear type of ship, and then the other one is a round ship. And the linear ships have a different control system for turning them, whereas the round ships turn in a number of directions. And they turn peripherally. They can go backwards, forwards, right, left, whereas the linear ships tend to turn their one end in the direction of travel, maybe two directions in case of some of the cigar-shaped ships. But this particular type, the flying turtle type, appeared to be the kind that I saw in the U.S. Air Force intelligence films that were made over Germany in World War II, and I have heard various references to these things, that they were unmanned and all this kind of stuff, and that just wasn't true. No, they had a pilot. You could see the cockpit glinting.
It would seem more difficult to have remote-controlled devices in the time period that we're talking about than it would to have an actual pilot,
Yeah.
which in their minds would be expendable.
Well, the film that I saw had some humor. You could laugh if you saw it, because the ship...
You're describing a gun camera
Yes.
footage that you had seen?
Yes, well, it was actually, the camera operator was behind the gunners. Ordinarily, they mount a camera on guns that takes photos as they shoot, but in this case, the camera operator was behind the gunners, and it was in the side bay with I presume, a 50 caliber machine gun that slid back and forth on this rack that they had it on. And as the plane flew along, the Foo Fighter, or Flying Turtle, was flying in a spiral pathway around the plane like this, very fast. And for comparison for speed, in the picture you see a Messerschmitt 263E, which is a rocket plane, it's a disposable rocket plane, flying around over here trying to get a shot with its 20mm cannon. And at one point you see the pilot jettison the plane and bails out, and the plane goes down. They were disposable planes made out of plywood.
So both of these, the rocket fighter that you're talking about, and the turtle fighter, I'm just calling them Foo Fighters, were buzzing around this bomber.
Yeah, presumably the Foo Fighter was to distract the gunner while the Messerschmitt guy comes in and shoots him with a cannon. That was the strategy. They didn't have any weapons on the Foo Fighters. Didn't appear like there was any weapons on board.
I see. So they were either going to try one or the other.
And
the Foo Fighter being probably there to, if it could get close enough, disrupt the ignition system. Or if the rocket fighter could get a shot in.
The gunner couldn't get a shot, even though he had some tracers in his rounds. You could see him. He'd swing the gun over here, and the Foo Fighter would come around like this, and as soon as it come into view, he'd start trying to get a shot, but he couldn't give enough lead. He couldn't move the gun fast enough. By that time, he's out of sight. So then he starts pulling his gun over here and waiting for it. And so that as soon as he sees it pop into view, he can pull the trigger and get a lead on it. But he still couldn't. I didn't see any hits. But it was. You can compare the speed of this Foo Fighter and know that it was flying in a spiral path several times faster than the Messerschmitt, which had a speed of over 500 miles an hour.
And there was an awareness from the pilot that it was being shot at and it was trying to avoid.
Yes.
Now, people would listen to this and they're going, my God, I thought Foo Fighters were just some fleeting thing that somebody saw, a couple of times while they're flying their B-17, and now you're talking about, actual air-to-air combat with these gadgets. Obviously, in the mix, fighting a war, then if the question would arise, I guess, that if they had these miracle weapons, let's call it that for now, why didn't they just throw everything they had at the B-17s and just wipe out the entire fleet? They could obviously outmaneuver. They could obviously, do all kinds of things to just basically turn off a B-17 and mid-flight. Why didn't they win the war?
I think they had there were a number of things involved. First of all, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what was going on in World War II anyway. For one thing, the Germans didn't really let loose and bomb England. They could have sent bombers over there and decimated the place. They didn't do that. They believed that they would eventually get the English as allies. The purpose
even while they were at
yes.
World War with this country?
All they intended to do was carry on a terror bombing in England, to terrorize them, to force them to fall into line with them and back them against Russia. They actually believed to the very end that eventually England would see the light and join with them to fight Russia.
Do you think there was anything, in your opinion, behind the scenes of the conventional politics of Hitler was this lone nut who initiated World War II, and we are entitled to only blame him? Are you of the opinion there's something more to that?
Well, there's a big industrial plan. I mean, the thing that I came up with in the book that's very controversial, I'm sure, and I'd heard about it for years, and I'd heard about something called Morgenthau's pastoral policy, and I had heard that it was a forgery. It was supposedly a plan to exterminate the Germans under the Treaty of Versailles. Now, I thought it was curious that there was a second Morgenthau's pastoral policy in World War II, which was authored by Hans Morgenthau's son, or Hans Morgenthau Jr. had authored that plan in World War II, and that was a plan of denazification after the war was over. Whereas the first Morgenthau's pastoral plan, as I found out later, actually turned out to be factual. And the way I found out about this was there was a student at the university who was a PhD candidate in history, and he had access to LBJ's papers. And we were attending a cocktail party before a gala for the arts that was given by Governor Connolly in about 1968, I believe it was. And this guy had introduced himself to me as a PhD candidate in history who was specializing on the Treaty of Versailles. So I said, you might be able to answer a question for me. I've heard that about a document that I've heard was a hoax. And he said, what document is that? And I said, Morgenthau's pastoral policy. And he smiled and he said, would you come? You got a few minutes? And I said, yes, I guess so. He says, come with me. So he smartly walks out of the building we're in and goes into the main building, takes me up to, I think, maybe the 4th floor or something like that. Walks in, he opens a vault, and he says, are your hands clean? He says, dust off your hands, make sure your hand's clean. And he goes in and he brings out this document. He says, hold out your hands, and he handed it to me, and it was the document. It was stamped by the Versailles Committee. It was signed by President Woodrow Wilson, and it stated exactly what I had heard. I think the problem with this document, the reason it was called a hoax, is no one knew where it was. If you don't know where a document is, you can't find it.
Right.
And this document probably would have been classified if they'd had a classification system in 1919. However, it did state that the purpose, one of the proposals, the proposal made to the Versailles Committee and introduced by President Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, which was authored by Hans Morgenthau Sr., it was called Morgenthau's pastoral policy because it stated that the Germans should be exterminated under the Treaty of Versailles because they're an inherently warlike race, and that Germany should be reduced to a pasture land. And that was pretty drastic. Imagine what somebody would think if they found out about that. Imagine what kind of results that could have.
That's controversial in itself, the story you just told. However, there's something even bigger as far as a stalemate that you talk about at the end of World War II. Now, in the books I read, we won World War II. You have a differing opinion about that, and it has something to do with submarines and missiles.
That stalemate was brought to my attention in the same set of documents that this Treaty of Versailles came out of, which was LBJ's papers. These papers are in the LBJ School of Public Service and the Sid W. Richardson Research Center, which were created by Lyndon Johnson. And at the time that I found out about these, they were being stored in the main building until these buildings that were eventually built at the University of Texas were completed. And these PhD candidates had access to these papers, and these papers were presidential papers, so they weren't classified, although they definitely would be if the intelligence community had had anything to do with it. However, there were these papers, and these graduate students had access to them. And this graduate student saw the whole scenario that described the end of World War II, and it involved the Germans sending 24 special U-boats carrying rockets with nuclear warheads, neutron bomb warheads, and they surrounded the country and basically blackmailed the country into signing or agreeing to a certain end of the war, which is different from what we're told.
It
wasn't unconditional. Yes.
Settlements.
It was a negotiated settlement, and the Germans, by the time they got these subs in position and the rockets ready to fire, the Russians were already overrunning Germany. So it was so late in the war, and at that point, if they'd used the missiles on the United States, they could have bombed us and done a lot of damage, but they wouldn't have been able to even go back to Germany, because by that time the Russians would have it. They would have everything.
A lot of people are under the opinion that Hitler's nuclear program was neglected, that Hitler himself had no respect for it, that he called it Jewish physics, that he was not interested in nuclear weapons. And the other thing I think a lot of people need to understand is when we talk about nuclear weapons, we're not, a lot of people have the vision of the H-bomb in their mind, the mushroom clouds and things like that. That isn't necessarily what they were shooting for. They were shooting for a quick, dirty type of radioactive weapon. You mentioned the term red mercury.
Well, that was a clean bomb. The red mercury bomb, the neutron bomb, is a clean bomb, you see. And in late 1944, Goebbels called Werner Heisenberg, and he said, how close are you to getting a bomb that we can use on New York City? And how big will it have to be? And he said, it would take a bomb about the size of a baseball to do damage to New York City.
He was confident enough at that time to make
Yes.
that claim?
Yes, and he said, you can tell the Fuhrer that we'll have a basketball for him at Christmas. And so there you've got a neutron bomb. And the thing that corroborated this for me was in approximately 1961, when I was working for Union Oil Company of California. I worked with an engineer from Roswell named Dave Dunn. And during the war, Dave was the commandant of the POW camp in Roswell, and where the prisoners of Rommel's Afrika Corps were brought. And the prisoners had postcards with them, which showed New York City being nuked. It was a nuclear weapon. You could tell the cloud was a nuclear cloud, and the photograph was a composite of two photographs, and they were halftones made by Hitler's, or rather Rommel's, field lithographers while they were in North Africa as a morale builder. And what they'd done is they'd taken a picture of their neutron bomb tests, which they did on the Libyan desert, which is why they were down there in the first place. They took a photograph of the neutron bomb explosion and a photograph of New York City, and they superimposed, they put these things together in a montage to show New York City being hit by this nuclear weapon.
I think people would be a little traumatized to think that somehow the end of World War II ended differently than most people have been taught.
Well, it's a peculiar thing. I mean, it's a peculiar thing that people have this understanding that the Germans were just out to kill everybody in sight, and that they would have used a weapon if they'd had it. That's not necessarily true, because they had many opportunities to do much more damage than they did and didn't. So it all depends on a lot of peculiar circumstances. After all, you had a leader, Hitler, who was guided by astrology. You know, if the stars weren't right that month or that year or that day, it would influence everything.
So you feel that might have played into some of his decision-making or lack thereof?
It probably did. After all, you had one of the top leaders, Hess, who took off in an airplane and flew to England thinking he was going to convince the English to join with Germany against Russia.
I guess
and
that would be a bit delusional, wouldn't it?
And, you know, he actually believed he could do it. And he had good reason to believe that there was plenty of influence in England, and believe me, there was plenty of influence in England along that direction. But Churchill wouldn't have it.
Now, I think a lot of people would be comforted by the fact that if you were the only one that was making these outrageous claims about stalemates with nuclear weapons launched from submarines,
yes.
Maybe they would like to pick this up at their nearest Borders bookstore. Actually, this was printed in 1995. It's called Vengeance, Hitler's Nuclear Weapon, Fact or Fiction. This individual states in the inside of the cover here, from 1943 onwards, Hitler and the Nazi propaganda machine poured forth a torrent of warnings to the Allies about a miracle weapon. This book reveals that far more lethal vengeance weapons existed, not as a wild fantasy of Hitler's imagination, but a form of a cargo of highly radioactive material carried in a modified V-2 rocket designed to be launched from special sites in France. These deadly rockets had the potential to turn Britain into a radioactive wasteland. This man is an engineer. He worked during World War II. He has diagrams and also the photographs of the silos in France, this technology existed.
Well, this very definitely. I've heard stories that what they'd done. I don't add much credence to this. That what they tested in North Africa was the atmospheric bomb. Which is propane gas that's exploded, and there's a second detonation. And these things are very close to nuclear power, but
almost like an air fuel bomb.
Yeah, air fuel bomb, what they call an atmospheric bomb. That's not what they tested. I don't believe that. They went down to North Africa to test this, and they covered it up by saying that they were fighting a delaying action, because from the time, and I don't remember what year it was, that Hitler transferred 15 mobilized units from the Western Front to open a new front or from the Eastern Front to open a new Western Front. The generals knew from that time on that it was just a matter of time before the war was lost, and everything was a delaying action from that time on. And that's at that point is when they sent Rommel to North Africa, which is ridiculous because that's just definitely out in left field. Why would he go down to North Africa to test a neutron bomb? To test weapons they couldn't test anywhere else.
Yeah, what were they there to do? Capture some land?
Sure.
Some nice desert land?
And the whole thing is, there's already documentation to back this up that the Germans were making several attempts to bomb New York City. That was a big fixation, I think. And some of these battles actually occurred within eyesight of land. There was one case where I think they called it the April attack, where they sent something like 5 submarines. It might have been 5, might have only been 3. I don't recall right at this moment. And there was a carrier 12 miles away from this submarine. When the submarine was finally hit, it set off an explosion which rocked the carrier 12 miles away.
So apparently there was something pretty explosive on that.
Yeah, carriers don't rock very easily.
What I'd like to show now is a photograph which comes from the book Vengeance. I guess we didn't mention that the fact that the Japanese and the Germans were still allies at this point. And what we're looking at here are 2 Japanese submarines. These are the world's largest submarines in the world at this time. They carried aircraft on them, and they also carried all of the material to make nuclear weapons in their cargo. The book also goes into detail. It gives you a list of the material that they were shipping to Japan, back and forth from Japan, basically, which could be used for nothing else but the making of nuclear weapons. And again, this author feels that this was, in fact, their intention.
Well, they found one large sub in Indonesia, a German sub. They captured a German sub carrying a large shipment of mercury to Japan. And so it indicated that the Japanese were getting ready to build red mercury neutron bombs, and the Germans were assisting them. I'll give you an example of how we're lied to. If you ask anyone at Los Alamos when the first nuclear explosion was detonated in the United States, they will tell you that it was the Trinity Site explosion. But the fact of it is the first nuclear explosion detonated in America that I know of was on the Sacramento River in California. It was a Navy test.
How is that possible?
They did it. They did it in the Sacramento River, and they even filled a ship full of sailors, what some people think were sailors. Actually, what they did is they had the military police go out on the streets of San Francisco and round up all the zoot suiters they could find. And there were 400 of these people put on one of these ships and used in this nuclear test on the Sacramento River. And they set off a nuclear detonation in the Sacramento River at a place called Port Chicago, California.
Now, were there eyewitnesses to this test? I mean, we're
sure.
talking about Sacramento.
Yeah. Well, it was a witness. There were plenty of witnesses. How do they shut all those people up? I don't know. All I know is they do it. That's a big question. How do you get that many people to shut their mouths?
I guess back at the period of time we're talking about, it's a little more, probably a little easier. There were probably a whole lot less people that we're talking about. We're not talking millions.
Yeah, they took. It was a Navy conducted test. They had a lot more power in those days than they do now. They could clear the area of people, a lot easier than they would now, and people would obey them without.
And where does this information come from?
I'm trying to remember the name of the man who first exposed this, but the information dovetails with the information that I know about the shore patrol rounding up zoot suiters. I know 3 people who were in the shore patrols that rounded up the zoot suiters that were used in the test. And I thought they just took them down and shot them on the beach. The justification for rounding up the zoot suiters was that they were molesting the wives of
Sure.
soldiers and sailors who were fighting the war.
Are we talking about the same event that they actually made a movie out of called Zoot Suit, where there was a confrontation between Navy sailors and zoot suiters?
I'm sure there were plenty of those.
Talking about?
It was probably the same period of time. I don't know. I haven't seen the movie. I've heard of the name of this movie. Did they show something about
yes,
mass killings and stuff?
I don't think so. I'm just talking about as far as the confrontation between.
There was definitely
zoot
some
suiters
confrontations going on.
Yeah.
And
it's an interesting subject to turn into a musical of all things. But the fact that
wouldn't be such a pretty musical if the truth were really known.
Absolutely.
That they rounded them up and used them in a nuclear test in the Port Chicago test, and that was before the Trinity site. So the truth about it is the first explosion wasn't at Fort Chicago. What is appalling to me is that they ever tested a nuclear weapon in the open air in the continental United States. I can't believe they did it.
Well,
and they were still doing it. When I was a kid.
They were probably so ignorant of the after effects of such a thing.
Oh, certainly. They didn't know anything about radiation.
Right.
You know.
And this was their way to find out. Maybe we'd like to talk a little bit about early vintage disinformation. What pops into my head? Some place around here called Roswell. You had an interesting chapter in your book about Roswell. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, when I was a boy, after World War II, you couldn't get building materials. It was all on a priority because of the war and so forth. GIs had certain priorities that they could get houses, under the GI Bill and whatever. But since we lived in the West Texas town of Kermit, we couldn't get building materials. My father bought the POW camp at Roswell, where they held Rommel's prisoners during the war. What a coincidence. And so hauled that down to Kermit, and we built a house and a store building and some apartments. Had the first motel there. And housing was there was such a shortage of housing, we had people driving to Kermit to have a place to sleep at night from as far away as Silver City. We had one family that owned a copper mine in Silver City that drove all the way to Kermit, and they would sleep in 24-hour shifts while half the family ran the mine. But anyway, we had connections in Roswell. We had friends there, and we had made trips up there. My father played golf, and I'd gone up there as a caddy when I was just a child, carrying this huge golf bag in these horrible hot weather. I mean, it was grueling. But I saw flying discs at a distance, and I had talked to oil field pumpers who, at that time, that area was just remote. It was hardly anybody living there. It was just a lonely, open expanse down there. And so, the flying saucers were being seen after the war because they brought all these Germans and these ships down there to Alamogordo. Roswell wasn't really a flying saucer base. It was an atomic bomb wing, and at one time had the Enola Gay there before they moved it.
Here we have on the screen here an early article talking about scores of saucers over the northwestern New Mexico oil town of 5,000 population.
Yeah, everyone was seeing these things. Now, so they had to create a scam to convince everybody that these things weren't government ships, even though everybody at first said, well, these are some of those Germans over there at Alamogordo or Fort Bliss or White Sands. That's where these things are coming from. So they created this thing, the intelligence personnel, and I don't believe the ones at Roswell even cooked it up. I believe the ones at Alamogordo did it. They had intelligence, they had guys from the Gestapo over there who had done this same thing in Germany during the war. So they took rhesus monkeys they were using on the rocket sled to test for acceleration. They had G-suits on these little monkeys, and they had to shave these little monkeys. And there were leaks. Their security wasn't as good as they thought, But they also showed newsreels at the movies that showed the rocket sleds with the monkeys on them in 1946.
And you feel that a lot of this stuff is rare now, as far as these kind of monkeys, for a reason?
Well, they used the rhesus monkeys in their early research, and then they switched to chimpanzees because the rhesus monkeys were probably harder to control. But they were short-tailed East Indian monkeys. And however, my brother-in-law's aunt was the nurse at Roswell, who was present when they brought these monkeys in from this hoax. That's not too much different than the one I saw that I had a photograph of.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute.
And that's interesting. That's very similar. It's amateurish. You can see rivets and stuff on there.
Absolutely. Anyway,
now,
finish your story about the rhesus monkey, and we can continue.
Anyway, my brother-in-law's aunt was in the Bataan Death March, so she was in the Bataan Peninsula during World War II. She had eaten rhesus monkeys because that's what they had to eat in that part. They had to eat rhesus monkeys and green chili. They had their own version of green chili, which she was used to since she was growing up in New Mexico. And after the war, after she was liberated from the camp, she came back to New Mexico and worked as an Army nurse at Roswell Army Airfield. And she grew up in Mescalero. You see, Mescalero was where Goddard's laboratory was. His test range was at Eden Valley. So my brother-in-law's aunt and her sister, Leona, wouldn't have missed a German count, 21 years old, who was in town for 2 years. You don't think those teenage girls would not notice that German count who was unmarried, who was handsome and debonair and all that stuff. So they knew about von Braun's presence in New Mexico. However, Leona had told me, and laughingly, how silly it was when they brought those monkeys in that Roswell hoax and commenced to do a dissection of the monkey as if they were dissecting an alien, because she knew it was a rhesus monkey all along. She later became a nun, and she's still a nun now. But she was the one that Glenn Dennis talks about.
Now, was this connected to Walter Haut? Did they just continue to
Walter Haut was the PIO, so he sent photographs out when they made that announcement about the alien ship that had crashed at Roswell. Now, here's a PIO who's an intelligence officer, sends out information about an alien ship and sends photographs, and it shows the aliens, which are really rhesus monkeys in G-suits. He sends them out to the area newspapers and a picture of a little flying saucer, which they'd fabricated because intelligence procedures wouldn't permit them to show a picture of a real saucer because that would be a violation of security. So they created a phony little funny book-looking little bubble on the top, and they put an auto antenna on the top. And they sent these out to the area newspapers. But then the Pentagon found out about it and hit the ceiling. And sent in people to retrieve all those photographs. Well, 2 of those photographs ended up in Lovington, New Mexico, in an old newspaper office in the back room in a dusty old drawer. A newsman found them there and gave them to me. And I had them for, I guess, a couple of years before they were stolen from me. And they were stolen by a lady who lived with Jacques Vallée, the ufologist.
Oh, Mr.
And they've never been published, so that tells you that the CIA got the photos back.
Yeah, here's Jacques Vallée that's going to give us all the good information, and he doesn't open his mouth about that one, huh?
Electrocraft. Yeah, that's some phony.
Here's another phony riveted UFO for our perusal here.
Yeah, they get a bunch of guys that nothing's going to be, they're not going to show anything classified. It's supposed to look a lot like the ship that was purportedly seen by, what's his name? What's that guy that saw the chicken feeder? You know?
Oh, Adamski.
Yeah, Adamski.
George Adamski.
Yeah, George Adamski. And so they use that mythology they created. So this looks a lot like the chicken feeder. And,
yeah, next I'd like to show the type of crowd George Adamski enjoys, or enjoyed he has his little mind control devices on his head for finding UFOs or whatever he wants to do with it. But here's something that a lot of people might be interested in. Looking very comfortable at a UFO convention is a very
Amazing
young,
Randy.
Amazing Randy. Amazing Randy and Andy. You know, just in
Birds
case,
of a feather flock together.
Yes, we have our Mr. Debunker here who feels right at home with some really
That's
strange...
the criticism, the big criticism I have about Philip Klass of the PSYCOPS, you know, Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Paranormal stuff. And the criticism I have about Philip Klass is he keeps making paranormal claims. You see, Klass asserts that everyone who sees a UFO believes in ghosts and, you know, all sorts of paranormal beliefs. And as far as I know, I don't know too many airline pilots who've seen flying saucers thousands and thousands of times, believe in ghosts or any of these other things that he says. So he's making an assertion without any kind of documentation to back it up, you see, and that to me is paranormal. So, you know, he's basically making a mystical claim, and which is out of keeping with his what I call a pseudo-skeptical idea. Going
the other end again, as far as mystical claims, we have an individual named Brother Philip here, who, in another life, his name was George Hunt Williamson.
Yeah.
You familiar with George?
This is early. What's the date on this?
You know, it's hard to say. I think this is around 1971.
Okay. See, during World War II, the German intelligence community had a whispering campaign that they were meeting with alien Venusians in Peru. And so this is just a continuation of the intelligence stuff that the Nazis started.
Here's a good photograph of our friend George Hunt Williamson.
A distinguished young American anthropologist.
Yeah, Brother Philip, in a previous life here, he also was a member of the Adamski expedition on November 20th, 1952, when physical contact was made with a flying saucer. And one of the occupants, it was Dr. Williamson who made the plaster cast of the footprints of this man from outer space. So we have an early rendition of their
they get a credentialed archaeologist, or anthropologist, I take it back, and that's kind of like Zachariah Sitchin, this guy who reads Sumerian, and is going to tell us about the alien reptiles.
You're not going to tell me that Zachariah Sitchin is not being straight with us.
I know a lot of people who are duped by that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't believe
it. It's very popular. Here's another, you might call it an alternate biography of George Hunt Williamson. Claimed a doctorate in anthropology and was one-time follower of Guy Ballard's I Am movement, an organization with an unsavory reputation for overlap with the pro-Nazi silver shirts.
Isn't that interesting?
An American subversive body broken up by the U.S. government after America entered World War II. Yeah. And now he's called Brother Philip. Let's see. Williamson organized the mysterious Brotherhood of the Seven Rays, which he presided over as Brother Philip in a remote retreat high in the Andes Mountains of South America. He was certainly an initiate, and he was given to ciphers and intrigue. This is from a book called The Secret Ciphers of the Ufonauts. But I thought that little short biography deserves some mention.
Yeah, the I Am movement and the silver shirts, yeah, and Walter Pelly and the whole thing. You know, I mean, that doesn't surprise me because the first time I heard this story about the little alien reptile who lived under the pyramid at Giza, it came from a Navy intelligence worker,
You think that they'd
CIA.
You think that they'd have better things to do with their time?
Yeah, well, this guy claimed that, and all he was doing is repeating the stuff. He had the documents with him, which on contract for Wright-Patterson, he was rewriting for American distribution. And these documents, what they were, was the Ostara documents that were the basis for the Thule-Gesellschaft in Germany. They were originally created by Father Joseph Lanz, who later became Georg Lanz von Liebenfels and founded the new religion called Order of the New Dawn, also known as Ostara, which later became Ashtar, or Ostara. When this guy, Hundley, rewrote it for the CIA, then it became known as the Ostara religion. The Cheneys led that group, and it still exists. This Mrs. Cheney is still alive, but her husband apparently has already passed away. But now we know it as the same thing that we see on the what is it called, the Stargate SG-1 series. Is based on that same thing. Now
that's true, and you have the lizard character who reveals
all they do is they take an ancient religion that's based on some folk mythology about animals, and all of a sudden that snake becomes this alien serpent who lives under the Great Pyramid at Giza. And
it never ends.
So all that stuff is in that Stargate stuff. It's now known as the Ashtar Command, too. That's another
I think I've seen that in our local New Age bookstores. In the used section.
But it's a Nazi religion, and it's the basis for the Thule-Gesellschaft.
Here's something that we might want to take a look at as far as Brother Philip. This is an interesting mention of international bankers in the United Nations, which I thought was quite ironic in some respects. The United Nations must collapse because that which you read from the Nostradamus forces is true. The warlords, the international bankers, will use the United Nations to form their super government. This will not be. There are no Christ forces in the United Nations. That does not mean that there are not some good people who are in the United Nations, but the organization itself is a center using gullible people. I say it is a demon controlled and must go down. The Master has said, it is written in Corinthians by our beloved Paul, all forms of authority and power must be put down before I come. And the United Nations fits that category. Now, you'd think that these characters who, pretty much are United Nations cheerleaders would have a little nicer things to say about the United Nations.
Well, the strange thing about it is the way I can think about it is I believe that the United Nations is actually a pre-planned continuation of the Third Reich. And
you feel there's a connection?
Yeah, definitely. And I believe that, see, if you looked at the Nazi ideas, they were divided. There was one group that wanted it. They were kind of like the Trotskyites and the Stalinists, The Stalinists wanted to rule from Mother Russia, and the Trotskyites wanted an international communism, truly international communism. Well, the Nazis, some of them wanted a nation state from Germany, while the others wanted an international Nazi state. And the idea was national concentrationism, and that appears to be what they're doing. Look at what they're doing in Kosovo. They're purifying that area, driving out all the Serbs, so they have a purely, a racially pure group there. And meanwhile, the Serbs will be over here, and everybody's
getting... So the ethnic cleansing is being accomplished by
it's basically
somebody.
Just separate everybody so they can create frictions when they want to control everything.
Sure. And it doesn't hurt to have one of the hugest, the biggest mines in the world, the fourth largest, right there in Kosovo, which is ironic. I'm sorry, the name escapes me right now, but
they have minerals there.
That's in the open literature. You
can
read
I feel like the real value of that area is ancient. That is a pathway, a land bridge, a pathway between Asia and Europe. And if the Chinese ever want to conquer Europe, they'll come right through there, the land army. You can't conquer people with aircraft. You have to have a land
you have to
army.
hold the ground.
And if they've got those Albanians who have always been pro-communist, they've always been pro-Chinese, They've never really been in with the Russians, even during all the communist years of the Soviet regime. They've always been tighter with the Chinese, and it looks like they're creating a pathway for the Chinese army to conquer Europe. That's just one theory, but that's a possibility.
Well, a lot of people neglect to look at the strategy of these global events, and I think it's prudent to do so sometimes. One last comment I'd like to make about our friend Brother Philip here, up in the corner here. We have an interesting little symbol. Maybe you'd like to comment on how that...
That's one of the disguised forms of the all-seeing eye of God that you see on the dollar bill. The pyramid with the eye.
Yeah.
And the triangle with the dot, and that was the symbol. The triangle with the dot in the middle was the symbol used on the P2 project. And of course, von Braun was a Prussian member of the Masonic lodges in Prussia, and that goes back to the Prussian Illuminati, and that was the symbol used in that project, that P2 project.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, we see coincidences everywhere, and of course, if you see in the lower corner here, we have
the Ankh, the
Ankh.
Egyptian Ankh built into there.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure that was just coincidental, as most things are.
Well, you see, I believe that the people that design this stuff are these old Nazis from the Ahnenerbe who studied all this ancient history and stuff, and that's who the CIA hired. At the end of I say hired, they formed the whole CIA around them. They were the nucleus of the American CIA and the National Security Agency. As a matter of fact, the name Reichssicherheitshauptamt means National Security Agency Division 6.
How about that?
And the Division 6 of the Gestapo was the highest level area that dealt with this flying saucer technology.
So they traded in their jackboots and put on suits, and everything's all better now.
Now we've got, all this stuff to keep us mesmerized. The whole idea was based on a mass psychology program that was dreamed up by the Rockefellers and their psychologists. And when they chose Hitler to lead the German people, the idea was to stretch the credulity with paranormal stuff so that the public would accept the big lie. And of course, this stuff is credulity stretching.
Absolutely.
And it makes you really weak in the head. So when the government says something, you don't have any idea what they're talking about.
Sure. I noticed one more thing peeking out in the corner here is another one of their fun little symbols. Just thought I'd throw that in.
Circle with a dot.
Yeah. That is, I've seen that in Masonic text as well. So
it's really a sun symbol.
Sure.
And that was big with the Nazis. And of course you've got the rest of that stuff is just a bunch of mystical stuff thrown into.
Again, another interesting aspect of this thing was if we go back to Lonnie Zamora's sighting, the design that he drew that he saw on the side of the ship was very similar to this.
Well, I show a number of these little things in the book, that 4 or 5 of them. I think I have them in there in this new edition too, of the different symbols that they used that have been seen on flying saucers. Now, the saucer that I saw in '53 didn't have any. I didn't see anything in the way of insignias on it at all.
Probably still a prototype.
And it looked like a very prototypical type of thing, because I've never seen another ship quite like it, except the one that was photographed by Wilhelm Reich up in Rangeley, Maine.
Tell us about that. The film footage. What's the deal with Wilhelm Reich? Apparently, the government had a axe to grind with that guy.
Yeah, well, he was looking into stuff, and he was doing time-lapse photography for one thing, and in the time-lapse photography over his laboratory, you can see flying saucers and the constellations passing by while the flying saucers make blurbs like this all around. So he was getting time-lapse photographs, and he thought these were extraterrestrial ships, and he was going to the government to tell them about them. And he didn't realize he was sticking his head in the meat grinder. Absolutely. Because they didn't like it at all. They considered him subversive, and he was trying to do his duty as an American citizen, And at one point, they were filming his use of the cloudbuster to eradicate a bad cloud of deadly orgone energy, DOR, D-O-R, and he was using his cloudbuster, and the cameraman was behind him, and he and a couple other people were up there using the cloudbuster, and this was near a body of water and some trees, and there was this dark cloud, and he was eradicating. You see the cloud actually being wiped away by this cloudbuster, and inside the cloud was this flying saucer, and they were pointing the antenna, which is basically what this thing was, at the saucer, and the saucer just started going down, and it went down, and they got excited and took off running, and somebody knocked over the camera, and that was the end of the film. But I actually saw that at a theater, and I was really surprised at.
And how do you feel it got into the theater in the first place?
Oh, I think they filmed it, they boxed it up, they shipped it out before the government even knew the film existed, and by that time people had already seen it, but you'll never see it again. Certainly they retrieved that
They
film.
didn't have that kind of electronic intelligence that they have now.
Now you can't do anything like that and get away with it. It goes through the postal, and they scan it. They can scan letters. They use microwaves. They scan everything in the letter. Even though it's folded up, the microwave device actually unfolds the letter, reads it.
How about that?
Even in foreign languages.
You don't see that on the Discovery Channel.
And they scan it for certain words and stuff, and that technology was in existence in 1969. And the microwave can distinguish between different layers of paper, you see, and then unfold the whole thing. This all happens in nanoseconds, you know. And meanwhile, in 1957, the U.S. Air Force had a scanner that could scan Pravda, translate it, and print it out in English in 2 hours, 1957.
And it becomes the L.A. Times.
Yeah. Yeah. And how could they do that in 1957 when
That's
the
pretty
public
impressive,
didn't have
isn't
that technology until about 5 years ago, you know?
That's right. Of
So
course, it goes back to what we were saying about
Technology theft and concealment.
Right. Getting back to World War II briefly, just to finish up, of course, if we are to take into account a stalemate between the Nazis and the Americans at this point, what are we to believe about our old nemesis, Adolf Hitler? You make some claims about him.
Well, people have taken me to task on it, but I honestly don't believe anybody could look that much like Hitler as the man I saw in San Antonio in 1967.
Explain that a little.
And, well, I was selling paintings with my friend on the San Antonio River. I was sitting in the amphitheater. The Arneson River Theater was just across the San Antonio River, and I looked down the walk, and there came a man and a woman. The man was wearing a suit that was a kind of a raw umber color, and or rather, yeah, it was raw. It was a yellowish mustard color, which was one of Hitler's favorite colors, by the way. And I could see that surgery. I could see marks on his face that surgery had been done here, but it didn't affect it. He still looked like who he was. And he was limping, and his pants were too short. That was another thing. He had a habit of wearing his pants too short. And the woman with him had dancer's legs, and she had red hair, and she was a little taller than him. And they came down the walk, and I said, just before this, though, there had been a couple of guys in suits who came up there and went through where we were and talked to us, engaged us in conversation. And they were both electrical engineers from Kassel, Germany.
Huh.
And I
That's
thought,
quite
well, this is interesting. So then these German engineers went on by and then looked down there, and I nudged my friend and I said, look who's coming down the walk. And he said, oh my God. I didn't even have to say. He knew who it was. And I said, look who's coming down the walk, you know. And I said, I didn't want to attract too much attention. I had on sunglasses, and I said, he's going to pick up that painting right there. And I knew he was going to pick up that painting, and he did pick it up. And then all of a sudden, these German, quote, engineers got his attention, and then he looked up, and he went, and he put the painting down, and they hustled off.
And then what year was this? What year?
1967, when Hemisphere opened.
Oh, interesting.
And then a couple of more, quote, engineers, electrical engineers from Kassel, Germany again, came by and debriefed us and went on with the entourage.
Must have been some kind of tour bus let off there.
Yeah, Hitler was visiting his relatives in Fredericksburg. He had relatives there. He had an uncle there. He had other relatives, yeah.
That's
and as his old uncle told my uncle, he said, "Ach, und dat Adolf always was a troublemaker."
Yeah, that's the understatement of the century. Now, you want to explain to us your contention about how Hitler might have escaped? You know, because everybody's bringing up these ideas about bone sample, you know, his teeth, his skull. You know,
we
he
had
shot
the
himself.
intelligence photos that the Russians furnished us right in our library when I was in Air Force Intelligence, and they had a picture of the guy they were saying was Hitler, and he was shot in the head, and he had attached earlobes. He looked just like Hitler, but he had attached earlobes. And I said, "That's not Hitler." And these guys said, you know, that worked with us, said, "Why not?" I said, "Look at his earlobes. He's got attached earlobes."
Yeah. It's
then,
well known that Hitler had over 100 body doubles for all different purposes.
Yeah, he had 5 main alphas, and they would often be in the parades, and they're not even sure that some of them didn't give some of the speeches that he supposedly gave.
That would be interesting.
And that way he could be in more places at the same time, too. You know?
Sure, that would be a media
everybody could say they
stunt.
met the Fuhrer and touched him and stuff, you know. The thing about it is, here was 4 or 5 bodies that looked like Hitler found around the bunker. When you know,
why is that one Hitler if you got
yeah,
5 of these
what do you
characters?
need so many lookalikes dead, you know? Now, the body that they claimed was Hitler that was burned, okay, that was Goebbels and his wife. They never found Goebbels' body. They never found his wife's body. They found all his children's body in the bunker, all dead.
Now, here's an
But
interesting...
why didn't they find Goebbels or his wife's bodies? Because they were the ones that were burned, and you can take one look at that corpse and know it's Goebbels. You got that Egyptian beak nose, you know, and you know, and it's not Hitler, you know. And
I'd like to get to Hitler's escape. This is an interesting contention about Hanno Reich. Explain that to us about how this was, because, see, the reason I'm interested in this is that if you look at the conventional literature about the fall of Berlin, it will tell you that there were hundreds of airlifts being, you know, going in and out of there even while the place was burning down. Are we to believe that Hitler was so insane he wouldn't, you know, hey, let's take a ride in a plane, let's get out of here?
if that was Hitler's body they found, the Russians
further.
could produce the DNA evidence to prove it, because they took those bodies to Russia.
Yeah,
And
you went a little further with your with how you felt he escaped.
They had a pad built on top of the bunker, and it had direct access from Hitler's room on the very bottom. And all he had to do was go right straight up a set of stairs to the top, and there was a pad, a landing pad that could only be used by a helicopter or flying saucer. And they had one of the top test pilots, Hanno Reich, along with Hans Ulrich Rudel. Now, Rudel was considered to be the successor to Hitler. And, I don't know whether you ever saw his combat record. Are you familiar with it?
Personally, no.
Fantastic, unbelievable. He personally destroyed, on the Russian front, over 300 Russian tanks.
Holy smokes.
He had a missing arm, and he managed to fly this way. I mean, he just couldn't be stopped. Hitler tried to get him to come back to Berlin, and he refused. Right to his face, he refused, and then Hitler gave in and said, "Go ahead, a real warrior, So he went back and fought to the very end. But here's Rudel in Berlin, visiting with Hitler along with Hanno Reich. There was two of the top pilots. I mean, this guy Rudel was phenomenal.
Absolutely.
He was shot down 38 times.
That's
and
impressive. Again, this is in the open literature about Hanno Reich, for instance, was in the bunker. I mean, you have one of the premier pilots of Germany with Hitler.
And the Russians admitted they didn't get Hitler's body, although they're still squabbling back and forth about it. They had so much as admitted, and boy, Stalin really wanted to get him, but supposedly they didn't get Hitler's body, and so my theory is that Hitler was provided with a comfortable place in Kassel, Germany, for the rest of his life.
Why not?
Why not? Beautiful area, and the site of the monument to the Holocaust. What better place to live, And plus I met people who were friends with Adolf Hitler. I met a man who was, this was really odd that this guy popped up when he did, but when I was coming back from Europe in 1975, a man approached me at the La Fonda in Santa Fe and told me that he was a good friend. I don't know why. Why did he do this? You know, it was the CIA. The CIA at that time was trying to hire me. So this guy shows up and he said, I've been a lifelong friend of Adolf Hitler, and I've lived in Bavaria since 1938. And I'm on my way back there. And he was an American, and but he was among Hitler's personal friends. And so I thought, well, this is really odd, you know. How is it that this guy approaches me and
how do you feel
tells me that? Huh?
How do you have
it was part of the CIA thing.
So you feel that
it was a CIA thing, you know. It's like when I went to Italy, okay.
Kind of to drop you a line, just
it's
to
like
mess
when
with
I went to the port of Naples, okay. I had my baggage. I got off of this Yugoslavian freighter, and I got ready to go through customs, and the Italian customs man said, "You're a very famous man, Mr. Lyne. You can go right on through."
Wow.
And
How about that?
so then when I got to Rome, at the railway station in Rome, after I got off the train, this old mafioso guy approaches me and said, "I love America. I would very much like to come back to America if the government ever permits me. But I'm here to tell you that you are protected. If you ever need help, my room is there in that building. Just ask for me." And I don't remember his name, but he looked like somebody like old Lucky Luciano or somebody, you know. Wow. Of course, Lucky was killed, but he was an old mafia guy who had been kicked out of the country, and he was working for the CIA to work his way back, you know. And he wanted me to know that I had protection, and that was your CIA. That was your George Bush. You
Sure,
know,
I would assume they would know your movements in and out of
it
cities.
was horrible.
Anybody's
I couldn't get away from them. They tried to get me at work in the movie industry there. They tried to get me to infiltrate German terrorist groups. There was all kinds of stuff going on. These were like people that worked for Time Life.
And this is because of your family connections that
it was because George Bush and the CIA, you know. I mean, my first cousin was Bush's secretary for 5 years, but my first in-laws apparently were big buddies with the Bushes. And Bush had just decided that I was going to be one of his people, and I don't know, maybe I'd have ended up being Secretary of Defense if I'd have said yes. But I wouldn't have any part of it. Boy, they don't like no for an answer. But it was just the weirdest bunch of stuff you ever saw, and I couldn't get away from them. They were everywhere. I realized that I was surrounded by all these intelligence spooks and stuff when I was in.
They like to keep to their own, so.
Yeah, they were actually, even though they were posing as all sorts of stuff, you know, actors and so forth, but they were all on part of it.
Art students.
Yeah.
Right.
There weren't any art students. The art thing had really burned out in Germany. But, yeah, I could go on and on about that. I don't want to blow the cover on some of these people. They're nice people, but they're
mixed up with
bad
stuff.
Bad circles. You know, you can't lie down with dogs without getting up with fleas.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'd like to thank Mr. Lyne for being our guest on the 33rd Parallel. I hope there are many who feel as I do, that it's a good and healthy thing to entertain alternative views on items of such importance as our world history and scientific progress. This is, in fact, the primary objective of this video series. I hope you found it worthwhile. And remember, a good conspiracy depends on your cooperation. Thank you. A companion guide to the 33rd Parallel video series will soon be available. Look for it on our website at www.flyingsaucerfactory.com. Also available now from the Flying Saucer Factory: a German U-boat on the United States coastline, a secret agreement between sworn enemies, an underground base built into the permafrost of Antarctica, Rear Admiral Byrd and his armada of 4,000 men, in a confrontation with unknown aircraft that can fly from pole to pole in a matter of minutes. When reading about it isn't enough, it's time to see what you've been missing. A graphic dramatization of Admiral Byrd's Operation High Jump, fully illustrated by a top Disney TV animator. Order it now from the Flying Saucer Factory at www.flyingsaucerfactory.com.